The wind roared across the empty streets of Chicago, carrying a piercing cold that cut through Amelia's thin clothes like icy claws. She hugged her knees to her chest, shivering uncontrollably as she crouched in the shadowy corner of an old brick building. Snowflakes floated down, clinging to her tangled brown hair and the frayed scraps of what used to be a coat. Her numb, stiff fingers gripped her threadbare blanket, the only thing she owned, barely enough to fend off the chill, but all she had left. Her teeth clattered as hunger clawed at her empty stomach. The city buzzed around her, its people bundled in thick coats and scarves, heads bowed against the wind, too lost in their own lives to see the shivering girl tucked in the shadows. A dull ache throbbed in her chest, a silent tally of the endless nights she'd faced. Cold, alone, invisible. The harsh reality of the streets had stripped away the last echoes of her childhood innocence. Then, piercing the wind's howl, a faint clatter reached her ears, a restless, uneven sound drifting from a narrow alley nearby, tugging at something buried deep in her frozen heart. Emilia had learned long ago not to hope for kindness from strangers. But then, cutting through the stillness, she heard it, a frantic, desperate scratching, faint but insistent. She raised her head, her breath clouding in the icy air, and squinted into the dimness. Her eyes darted toward a narrow alley beside the old brick building, where the sound grew louder, punctuated by a weak whimper. Heart pounding, she edged closer, her numb fingers still clutching her threadbare blanket. In the flickering glow of a street lamp, she saw it, a large German shepherd, its fur matted with dirt and snow, thrashing feebly in a tangle of old ropes. Its back leg caught tight. The dog's struggles slowed as it whimpered again, its strength fading, head slumping toward the icy ground. Emilia froze. She barely had enough to keep herself alive, let alone help another. But the sight of the animal, trapped and trembling, struck a chord deep inside her. She knew too well the sting of being unwanted. With a shaky breath, she unwrapped the thin blanket from her shoulders, the cold clawing at her skin instantly. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside the dog, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Hey, buddy, hold on." The German shepherd stilled, its deep brown eyes flickering open, wide with fear and exhaustion. Emilia's chest tightened. Carefully, she worked at the ropes, her stiff fingers fumbling to untangle them from its leg. The dog shivered harder but didn't pull away, watching her with a wary trust. "It's okay," she murmured, freeing the last knot. She draped the blanket over its body, tucking it around the damp fur. The dog let out a soft whine, its gaze locking with hers. Loneliness and desperation mirrored in those eyes, feelings she knew all too well. Gently, she ran her fingers through its cold coat. "You're not alone." With a shaky exhale, the German shepherd shifted, pressing its body weakly against her side. Emilia sucked in a sharp breath, the faint warmth of the animal pressing against her, a startling contrast to the biting night. A lump swelled in her throat. She had nothing left in this world, no family, no home, no future. Yet for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of loneliness eased just a little. Dawn crept over the rooftops, spilling a soft, pale light across the snow-dusted streets. Emilia stirred beneath the crumbling awning where they'd huddled through the night, her body aching from the cold, the roughness of the pavement still lingering in her bones. She shifted and felt a steady warmth beside her. Turning, she saw the German shepherd still nestled close, the tattered threadbare blanket draped unevenly over them both, its edges frayed from her efforts to free him. A faint smile cracked her chapped lips. It hadn't left. "Guess you're stuck with me now, huh?" she murmured, running her stiff fingers through its thick, damp fur. Its ears flicked at her voice, and it lifted its head, fixing her with those deep, knowing eyes. It was gaunt, ribs jutting beneath its coat, but there was a quiet strength in it, and something more. Loyalty forged in that desperate moment she'd untangled it from the ropes. Emilia pushed herself up, wincing as she stretched her sore limbs. "We've got to find food," she said, her voice low but firm. The dog tilted its head, blinking as if it understood her every word. Together they roamed the city, Emilia's sharp eyes scanning the crowd for anything, crumbs on a bench, a discarded apple core. But scraps were scarce, and kindness even rarer for a homeless girl and a scruffy stray. By midday, hunger gnawed at her insides, relentless and sharp. She and the dog, whom she'd begun calling Shadow for the way he stayed close like a silent protector, settled near a subway entrance. The bustle of people flowed past, their pockets rattling with loose change, their footsteps echoing on the cold pavement. Emilia sank down, pulling her knees to her chest and took a steadying breath. The memory of untangling Shadow lingered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this together. She had always found solace in singing, before life had snatched everything away, before the streets became her reluctant refuge. Hours once slipped by as she lost herself in melodies, imagining a spotlight on a grand stage. Now the stage was just cold pavement, but with nothing left to hold her back, she closed her eyes and let a tender, mournful tune spill out, weaving through the bustle of the street. Her voice, roughened by exhaustion, still carried a fragile truth, something shattered yet hauntingly beautiful. Most people hurried past, their eyes fixed ahead. A few glanced her way, only to keep moving. Then Shadow shifted beside her, his ears twitching as she sang. Suddenly, his paw nudged the small tin box she'd set out for coins, sending it clattering across the pavement. A young boy nearby darted over, scooping it up with a grin and holding it out to her. "You dropped this," he chirped. His mother, trailing behind, paused as Emilia's voice reached her. She smiled faintly, fished a few coins from her pocket, and dropped them into the box. Emilia's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the tin. Moments later, an older woman in a long coat stopped, her gaze softening as she watched the boy hand the box back. But it was Emilia's singing that held her there. "Lift your chin a little," she said gently, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Let the sound breathe. It's lovely." Emilia blinked, startled, but the woman, Clara, though Emilia didn't know it yet, offered a small nod before slipping back into the crowd. Shadow nudged Emilia's hand with his nose, his warm muzzle urging her on. She swallowed hard and kept singing, her voice trembling but growing steadier. For the first time on these unforgiving streets, people weren't just pitying her. They were listening, and somehow Shadow had helped make it happen. By the time the sun sank below the skyline, Emilia had collected more coins in a single day than she'd seen in a week. Enough for a warm meal, a rare luxury. She and Shadow trudged toward a small convenience store, the tin box jingling faintly in her pocket. As they passed a cafe, she caught a glimpse of someone across the street, an older woman in an elegant coat, standing still amid the evening rush. It was her, the one who'd paused by the subway entrance, the one who'd told her to lift her chin and let her voice breathe. Her gaze locked on Emilia in Shadow, sharp with recognition and something deeper. Regret, perhaps. Before Emilia could process it, the woman turned and melted into the crowd. A shiver ran through Emilia, not just from the cold. A strange feeling coiled in her gut. She didn't know it yet, but fate was weaving its threads tighter around her. The night turned brutal, the wind slicing through the streets like a blade. Emilia tugged her ragged coat closer, Shadow padding beside her, his ears twitching at every sound. The day had been a triumph, better than most thanks to Shadow's clumsy nudge of the tin box. She'd sung her heart out and earned enough to buy food for them both, a small victory in a harsh life. "You're my lucky charm, aren't you?" she murmured, reaching down to ruffle its fur. Shadow huffed, a puff of warm breath clouding in the frosty air. But as they veered into a dimly lit shortcut toward the abandoned lot where they sometimes slept, a prickle of unease tightened her chest. Something felt off. Before she could turn, a heavy thud of boots staggered behind her, followed by a slurred, rough voice. "Hey, watch where you're going, kid!" A man reeking of liquor stumbled into her, his shoulder knocking her off balance. A single figure lurched from the shadows, a bulky man, his steps unsteady, reeking of cheap whiskey. His coat hung loose, tattered at the edges, and his bleary eyes locked onto Emilia with a mix of confusion and irritation she'd seen too often on these streets. "You bumped me," he slurred, his voice thick and rough, swaying as he pointed a shaky finger at her. Emilia's pulse raced. She clutched her tin box tight against her chest and took a step back. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The man's eyes narrowed, his face contorting into a sneer. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled, lurching closer, his breath thick with booze. "I saw you raking in cash. Give me what you got." Emilia's stomach sank. He'd been watching her sing, eyeing the coins she'd earned. "Please, just go," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Shadow edged forward, a deep growl vibrating in its chest, its fur spiking as it squared itself between Emilia and the stranger. "Move that filthy mutt," the man barked, swinging a sloppy fist toward them, his greedy glare fixed on her pocket. Emilia flinched, backing up further. "Please, we don't have much," she begged, her voice trembling. But logic couldn't pierce through the man's drunken haze. He staggered forward, arms swinging wildly. Emilia gasped, tripping over her own feet. But before he could land a blow, Shadow sprang into action. A fierce bark sliced the night as the German shepherd darted in, teeth snagging the man's pant leg. Not a deep bite, just enough to tug hard and send him sprawling. The drunk hollered, arms thrashing as he hit the pavement. The drunk thrashed on the ground, his bloodshot eyes wild with frustration. "Get this mud off, I want that cash," he roared, flinging a frantic leg at Shadow, desperate to get back on his feet. Emilia watched it blur before her, the awkward kick slicing through the air toward it. "No!" she shouted, her voice breaking. But Shadow stood firm, yanking at the man's pant leg until the blow skimmed its flank, knocking it sideways with a quick yelp. It faltered briefly but sprang up again, a low growl rumbling from its throat, its gaze sharp and unyielding. The man sprawled in the snow, pawed at his torn pants, snarling, "Damn crazy dog!" He clawed his way back, limbs flopping in a drunken mess, then heaved himself up with a slurred grunt and stumbled off into the shadows. A deep quiet fell over the alley, interrupted only by Emilia's uneven breathing and Shadow's soft, shaky whimpers. She dropped to her knees next to it, her hands quivering as they ran gently over its fur. "Shadow," she said, her voice rough and full of worry. It was hurting. She could feel its body trembling a little, a tight spot on its side where the kick had hit. But its eyes looked straight into hers, strong and steady. Tears pricked her eyes, warm against the chilly air. She had nothing else. No house, no family. Just this dog. "You're all I have, buddy," she whispered, wrapping her arms around it. Its warmth hugged her back, its heartbeat solid under her fingers. Shadow brushed her cheek with a small, tired lick, like a quiet way of saying, "I'm not going anywhere." Emilia sat on the cold pavement, her arms curled tightly around Shadow. Its breathing had calmed, but she could sense it was uncomfortable. The drunkard's kick left a wound. Each time it moved a little, a quiet whimper slipped out, squeezing Emilia's heart. She had to help it somehow, but how? Her pockets held nothing for a vet, and no place would open its doors to a girl like her with a stray. The world had always turned a blind eye to her struggles. Why would it bother about a dog? Snowflakes floated down, vanishing as they brushed her skin. The city hummed around her, uncaring. Then a figure paused. A gentle voice pierced the fog of Emilia's dread. "You?" She lifted her gaze, blinking through the tears. It was the woman from before, the one by the subway, the one who'd told her to let her voice breathe, only to vanish into the crowd. But now she stood there, unwavering, her eyes fixed on Emilia in Shadow with a quiet intensity Emilia couldn't place. "I've been searching for you," the woman said softly. Emilia's muscles tensed, a reflex honed by years on the streets. People didn't look for girls like her unless they wanted something. The woman knelt, heedless of her elegant coat grazing the grimy pavement. Her gaze flickered to Shadow briefly, then settled on Emilia, searching her face with a strange, tender curiosity. "What's his name?" she asked, nodding toward the dog. Emilia swallowed hard, her grip tightening on Shadow's fur. "Shadow," she rasped. The woman's lips parted in a faint, wistful smile. "Fitting." Emilia's brow creased. "What's that supposed to mean?" The woman exhaled, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes clouding with memory. "I used to be a musician, a singer, long ago. My daughter, she loved dogs, especially German shepherds. She'd have adored him, but she's gone now. taken from me too soon. Her voice wavered, heavy with old sorrow. When I heard you sing today, she went on, it was like hearing her again. Raw, real, full of heart. Amelia's chest tightened, a mix of unease and confusion swirling inside her. It's mine, she said sharply, pulling Shadow closer. I don't care what you think. It's mine. The woman's smile deepened, warm and unguarded. I wouldn't take it from you, child. I see how much it means to you. Amelia faltered, thrown by the kindness in her tone. The woman's eyes softened, glinting with pain and a flicker of hope. I saw you earlier. Your voice, the way you held on to it despite everything. It reminded me of her and of what I've lost. Amelia's throat tightened. You've got something special, child. You remind me of my daughter. Resilient, fierce, with a heart that doesn't quit, the woman said, her eyes softening. That's why I want to help you. Amelia bristled, her guard snapping up. I don't need anyone's help. A quiet laugh escaped the woman's lips. Oh, I think you might. She slipped a hand into her coat, pulling out a simple card and offering it. Amelia eyed it warily before taking it, her fingers brushing the smooth edges. I'm Clara Belmont, the woman said. I have a home, a warm one, and a space where music lives. I'd like you and Shadow to come with me. Why me? Amelia asked, her voice sharp as she gripped the card tighter. Clara's gaze held hers, steady and sure. Because I heard your voice today, raw, powerful, like a gift waiting to bloom. And I see how you and that dog hold on to each other. It's rare, and I believe fate brought us back together. Amelia glanced at Shadow. His golden brown eyes met hers, calm, trusting, waiting. She'd spent years dodging, scraping by, but now someone was holding out a new road. And for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to bolt. Warmth enveloped Amelia, a sensation so unfamiliar it almost startled her. Cold had been her shadow for years, nipping at her fingertips, sinking into her bones, turning every breath to frost. But now nestled on a cushioned couch beneath the softest blanket she'd ever touched, that chill melted away, replaced by a gentle heat that felt like a stranger's embrace. Shadow sprawled beside her, his heavy head resting on her lap. His fur gleamed clean, his frame fuller with proper meals. The bruise from the drunk's kick had faded, patched up by a vet Clara had called the day they stepped into her home. Their home. Amelia could scarcely believe her eyes. It felt like stepping into a dream. Clara Belmont's house is not just a house. It's a large estate on the edge of the city, its elegant silhouette surrounded by fields that stretch toward the horizon. Beyond the manicured gardens, a sunlit studio gleamed with polished wood and glass, brimming with treasures of a musical legend. A grand piano draped in velvet, shelves overflowing with yellowed sheet music, gold-framed records glinting on the walls, and the faint hum of forgotten melodies lingering in the air. The main house rose like a melody itself, tall windows spilling warm light, walls adorned with faded posters of sold-out shows, and a sweeping staircase that seemed to echo with the applause of decades past. For the first few days, Amelia stayed on edge, her instincts sharpened by years on the streets, whispering that good things never lasted. But Clara asked for nothing in return. Instead, she offered Amelia a lifeline, a soft bed, warm meals, fresh clothes, and something she hadn't dared dream of, a future. Come with me, Clara had said one morning, guiding Amelia into the studio. You've got a voice that moves people. Let me help you shape it. And so Amelia began. Days stretched into weeks, and for the first time in years, she found a rhythm. She went back to school, something she hadn't touched since she was 12, learning to read music alongside her lessons. She spent hours in the studio, honing her singing, discovering chords and harmonies under Clara's patient guidance. She blossomed. And Shadow, he was her constant shadow as ever. Clara had seen it early on. He was no ordinary stray, his quiet intelligence shining through despite his rough start. With steady care and good food, he'd bounce back. The faint stiffness from that drunken scuffle now just a memory. He wasn't a trained legend here, but a loyal companion, his presence a steady comfort. Even now, as the snowflakes were falling heavily outside, he still snuggled closer, breathing deeply, peacefully beside her. Emily appeared through the wide bay window, the city's distant lights twinkling like stars. Out there were the streets she'd once roamed, the frigid corners, the hollow nights. She slid her fingers through Shadow's fur, soft and warm under her touch. "We made it, buddy," she whispered. Shadow huffed softly, a sound of quiet contentment. For the first time in her life, Emilia didn't have to question whether tomorrow held something better. She could feel it in the notes she sang, in the steady warmth beside her. Against all odds, Emilia and Shadow had found a home. Not just a shelter from the cold, but a life woven with purpose, love, and possibility. It began with a quiet act of compassion. A homeless girl kneeling in an alley, untangling a trapped dog from ropes with her frostbitten hands. And that moment had unraveled into the thread that rewove her fate. In return for her kindness, destiny handed her something she'd buried long ago, a second chance. Shadow was no longer just a stray. He was her anchor, her family, her quiet strength. Together they showed that, even in the bleakest shadows, a single act of care can strike a chord that echoes into light. Thank you for watching. We're on an exciting journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means a lot to us. Like, share, and subscribe to be part of this story.